Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The notification popped up on my phone during my lunch break at the marketing firm, where I'd been working since college graduation. My roommate from those days, Natalie, had posted another photo from her solo hiking trip in the Sierra Nevada, something she'd been planning since her messy divorce finalized in February. The picture showed her grinning at a mountain vista, backpack straps digging into her shoulders, her red bandana soaked with sweat. I double-tapped it without really looking, the way you do when you're scrolling mindlessly through a sandwich. But then my coworker Jenna leaned over my shoulder and asked who that guy was in the background, way back among the pine trees. I zoomed in and felt my appetite disappear. There was definitely someone there, just a dark shape between the trunks, maybe 60 feet behind where Natalie had set up her timer. The worst part was that Natalie had no idea anyone was there. Her caption just said something about finally finding peace after all the chaos. I immediately went back through her previous posts from the trip. She'd been documenting everything for the past 3 days, posting every few hours whenever she got signal. Sunrise shots, trail markers, her battered hiking boots next to streams. My 30th birthday was coming up next month, and Natalie had promised to be back in time for it. But now I was wondering if she'd make it back at all. The figure first appeared in a photo from yesterday morning. So far away you'd think it was just shadows playing tricks. But in each subsequent photo, that same dark shape got progressively closer. In her lunch photo from yesterday, you could make out that it was definitely a person in what looked like a brown jacket. In last night's sunset photo at her campsite, the person stood maybe 40 feet away, partially hidden behind a boulder. The most recent photo, posted just 2 hours ago, showed Natalie filtering water at a creek, and the man, because you could tell it was a man now, stood clear as day about 20 feet behind her, just watching. He wore regular street clothes, not hiking gear, and his face was turned away from the camera. But something about his posture made every hair on my neck stand up. The comments section under her posts had already started buzzing. People were asking about the photo bomber and whether she was hiking with someone. But Natalie hadn't responded to any of them, which was weird because she usually replied to everything within minutes when she had signal. I tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I tried messaging her through every app we had in common, Instagram, WhatsApp, even that stupid word game we'd been playing for years. Nothing. The last time she'd been online was 2 hours ago, right when she posted that water filtering photo. I started typing a comment under her post, deleted it, typed again. How do you tell someone there's a stranger stalking them without sounding completely paranoid? Finally, I just wrote, "Call me immediately when you see this," in all caps, and hit send. Jenna had gathered a small crowd around my desk by then, everyone squinting at my phone screen and arguing about whether we were overreacting. Our manager, Bradley, said it was probably just another hiker who happened to be on the same trail, that the Sierra Nevada routes were popular this time of year. But then our intern pulled up Natalie's Instagram on his laptop and projected it onto the conference room screen. When you saw all the photos laid out in a grid, the pattern was undeniable. The man appeared in 7 consecutive photos over 2 days, getting closer each time, always maintaining that same unnatural stillness while Natalie moved around doing normal hiking activities. In one photo where she was cooking dinner at her campsite, he stood just outside the circle of light from her camping stove, barely visible except for the reflection on what looked like glasses. Nobody takes the exact same route at the exact same pace for 2 days straight by coincidence. Bradley wanted us to get back to work, said we were making a mountain out of nothing, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets while my best friend might be in danger. I pulled up the Park Service website and found the emergency contact number for the Sierra Nevada district where Natalie was hiking. The ranger who answered sounded bored until I explained the situation. Then his voice changed completely. He asked for Natalie's full name, her planned route, and the GPS coordinates from her photos. Thank God she always tagged her locations. He said they'd been getting reports about someone matching that description, a man in brown clothing who'd been spotted near several solo female hikers' campsites over the past week. 2 women had reported items missing from their tents. Nothing valuable, just personal things like hairbrushes and worn socks. The ranger took down my information and said they'd send someone to check Natalie's last known location immediately. The waiting was unbearable. I stayed at my desk long after everyone else went home, refreshing Natalie's social media every few seconds and checking my phone for any response to my messages. Around 7 that evening, her Instagram account showed she was typing. Those 3 dots appeared and my heart jumped. But then they disappeared. Appeared again. Disappeared. This went on for almost 10 minutes, like someone was starting to type and then deleting it over and over. I screenshot everything and sent it to the ranger's email, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. At 7:23, she posted a new photo, but it wasn't really a photo, just a black screen. The caption only had her location tag, some coordinates deep in the wilderness, and nothing else. The comments exploded immediately with people asking if she was okay, if her phone was broken, what was happening. Then at 7:31, a 10-second video appeared on her story. The camera was pointed at the ground, showing pine needles and dirt, and you could hear heavy breathing, not like someone exhausted from hiking, but ragged, panicked breathing. Right before the video cut off, there was a man's voice, very calm and quiet, saying something that sounded like, "Not yet." I called 911 immediately, my voice cracking as I tried to explain everything to the dispatcher. She transferred me to search and rescue, where I had to tell the whole story again while sending them all the screenshots I'd saved. The coordinator said they were mobilizing a team, but it would take at least 2 hours to reach Natalie's last coordinates. The terrain was rough and the nearest access road was miles away. 2 hours felt like a lifetime. I called Natalie's sister in Colorado, woke her up and tried to explain without completely terrifying her. She said she'd drive to the airport immediately and catch the first flight out. Then I did something stupid. I posted in a massive hiking forum asking if anyone was near those coordinates, if anyone could help. Within minutes, 3 different hikers responded saying they were within 10 miles and would head toward her location. One of them, username Colorado Trail Dog, said he'd seen a man matching the description earlier that day, walking without any gear except a small backpack, no water bottles, no hiking poles, nothing you'd need for a multi-day trek. The Instagram story disappeared after an hour, the way they do, but her account stayed active, that green dot showing she was online. Every 20 minutes or so, another black photo would appear and then get deleted within seconds. Some had partial captions like "he says" or "still here," or just random letters like she was trying to type without looking. Colorado Trail Dog kept updating the forum thread, said he'd reached the general area and was calling out for Natalie but getting no response. He found fresh boot prints, 2 sets, one definitely smaller than the other, leading off the main trail into a dense section of forest. The Park Service told him to wait for the official team, not to follow the tracks alone, but he said he could hear something that might be voices further in the woods. His last update was at 9:47. Following the sound, phone at 8% battery, will update when I can. Then nothing. The search and rescue coordinator called me directly, his professional calm barely covering real concern. They'd found Colorado Trail Dog's abandoned backpack at the tree line, his phone dead on the ground next to it. The screen cracked like it had been stepped on. By midnight, the search and rescue team had set up a base camp near Natalie's last known coordinates. The lead ranger kept me on speakerphone as they worked, probably because I'd threatened to drive up there myself if they didn't keep me informed. They'd brought thermal imaging drones and search dogs, the whole production. Around 1 a.m., one of the dogs picked up a scent and led them through thick undergrowth to a small clearing. Natalie's tent was still standing, perfectly set up like she'd just stepped out for a minute. Her sleeping bag was unrolled inside, her camp stove sitting on a flat rock with a half-eaten packet of freeze-dried mac and cheese next to it. But Natalie wasn't there. Her backpack was gone, but weirdly her hiking boots were placed neatly outside the tent, toes pointing toward the woods. The search team found her phone about 30 feet from the tent, propped against a tree stump. It was still recording video, had been for 8 hours straight according to the file size, just filming the dark forest. The battery was almost dead, running on 2%. The ranger described everything to me as they processed the scene, and one detail made my whole body go cold. There were fingernail marks on several trees around the campsite, fresh scratches in the bark like someone had been dragged past them, trying to grab hold. The drone picked up 2 heat signatures about a quarter-mile north, moving slowly through difficult terrain. The team immediately headed that direction, but when they got close, the heat signatures separated. One stopped completely while the other moved rapidly away, too fast for someone carrying gear through the wilderness at night. They found Natalie sitting on a fallen log, barefoot, staring straight ahead. She was wearing different clothes than in her last photos, a man's oversized brown jacket over her hiking outfit. When the rangers approached, she didn't respond to her name at first, just kept mumbling numbers over and over. 873-294, 873-294. They wrapped her in emergency blankets and carried her to the helicopter that had just arrived. She was physically unharmed except for scratches on her feet and hands, but she wouldn't stop repeating those numbers or explain what had happened. I drove through the night to reach the hospital in Fresno, where they'd taken her. When I finally got to see her the next afternoon, Natalie was awake, but different. She'd answer simple questions, but would go silent whenever anyone asked about those missing hours. The police interviewed her multiple times, and she'd just stare at her bandaged hands and whisper those same numbers. A detective told me they'd run the numbers through every database they could think of. Coordinates, phone numbers, social security, license plates, but found nothing. The brown jacket she'd been wearing had no labels, no identifying marks, just smelled strongly of wood smoke and something chemical they couldn't identify. 3 days later, Colorado trail dog, real name Gary Brennan, walked out of the forest on his own, dehydrated and confused. He had no memory of anything after posting that last forum update, just woke up leaning against a tree with his shoes on the wrong feet and his backpack missing. The medical examination found a small injection mark on his neck, likely from some kind of sedative, but the toxicology results were inconclusive. They never found the man from the photos. The 8-hour video from Natalie's phone showed only darkness and trees, but the audio picked up footsteps circling the area for the first 3 hours, then nothing but forest sounds. At exactly 4:23:16 in the recording, there's a whisper that sounds like 873-294 repeated once, but the voice is too distorted to determine if it's male or female. Natalie stayed with her sister for 2 months after leaving the hospital, slowly returning to herself, though she never went hiking again and deleted all her social media accounts. She finally told me, 6 months later over coffee, that she remembered fragments. The man had never spoken to her directly, just walked behind her for 2 days, getting closer. When he finally approached her at the campsite, he'd sat across from her and pulled out a notebook filled with hundreds of photos of different women on hiking trails, all taken from behind, all at varying distances. He'd pointed to a blank page and then at her, like he was showing her where she fit in his collection. The numbers she kept repeating, she'd seen them written on the back of one photo that had fallen out. A woman who looked just like her, same red bandana, same build, standing at what appeared to be the same creek where Natalie had filtered water. The photo was dated from exactly 1 year before. October 2018 was supposed to be just another camping trip with my college buddies. I'd been managing a sporting goods store in Durango for about 2 years by then, right after my 26th birthday, while finishing up my accounting degree online. My roommate Kyle worked at the same store, and we'd been planning this hike for months with 3 other friends. Jason, who taught middle school science, his girlfriend Megan, who worked as a veterinary technician, and our buddy Christopher, who'd just gotten back from a year teaching English in Japan. We picked that specific weekend because the trails would be less crowded and the aspen trees would be turning gold throughout the San Juan Mountains. The weather forecast showed clear skies for 3 straight days, perfect conditions for what we thought would be a straightforward camping trip through some of the most beautiful backcountry in the state. We started our hike on a Friday morning from the Cunningham Gulch trailhead, each of us carrying about 35 pounds of gear, including our winter-rated sleeping bags since temperatures could drop below freezing at night, even in early fall. The plan was to follow the Continental Divide Trail for about 8 miles before setting up our first camp near Highland Mary Lakes. Around noon, we stopped for lunch where the trail split near a weathered wooden sign. The main path continued upward toward the lakes, but there was another trail branching off to the left, blocked by a rusted chain strung between 2 posts and a faded Forest Service sign that read, "Trail closed, hazardous conditions." Jason pulled out his GPS device and showed us that this closed trail would actually cut about 3 miles off our route, connecting back to the Continental Divide Trail further up. The path looked clear enough from where we stood, just slightly overgrown with some loose scree visible in the distance. Megan voiced what we were all thinking about taking the closed trail, saying it seemed like overkill to add 3 extra miles when the path appeared mostly intact. Christopher examined the sign more closely and noticed the date stamp was from 2015, suggesting whatever rock slide had closed it might have stabilized by now. Kyle was already unhooking the chain, arguing that the Forest Service probably just hadn't gotten around to reassessing the trail yet. The thing that convinced me was how many other boot prints we could see in the dirt beyond the chain. Clearly, we wouldn't be the first people to ignore the closure. We ducked under the barrier one by one, Jason making some joke about how his students would never let him live it down if they knew their science teacher was ignoring safety warnings. The trail started fine, maybe a bit narrower than the main path, winding through a grove of aspens whose golden leaves created a tunnel of light that made everything feel almost dreamlike. About an hour into the closed trail, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that none of us commented on at first. The aspens gave way to twisted pine trees that grew at odd angles, their trunks bent and gnarled like they'd been fighting against hurricane winds their whole lives. The bird sounds that had been constant all morning gradually faded until all we could hear was our own breathing and the crunch of gravel under our boots. Christopher kept checking his phone even though we all knew there was no signal out here, and Megan moved closer to Jason, linking her arm through his without saying why. The trail itself remained clear enough to follow, but the rock formations on either side started to feel oppressive. These massive granite walls streaked with what looked like burn marks, even though there hadn't been any forest fires in this area recently, according to the ranger station website I'd checked before we left. We found the first boot around 3 in the afternoon, just sitting there in the middle of the trail like someone had carefully placed it as a marker. It was a newer hiking boot, probably expensive based on the brand, size 11 or 12, with the laces still tied in a perfect bow. Kyle picked it up and examined it, turning it over to show us that the sole was barely worn, maybe only used for a few hikes. No foot inside, no blood, no signs of violence, just an abandoned boot that had no business being there. Jason suggested maybe someone had broken a lace and decided to leave it behind, but that didn't explain why they'd leave the entire boot or why it looked so deliberately positioned. We spent maybe 10 minutes searching the surrounding area for its pair or any other gear, but found nothing except some weird scratches on the nearby rocks. These deep parallel grooves that ran vertically up the stone face for about 15 feet before just stopping. The second strange discovery came about 20 minutes later, when the trail opened into a small clearing where someone had set up camp recently. Very recently based on how fresh everything looked. 3 tents were still standing, but every single one had been slashed open from top to bottom, the cuts so clean and straight, they looked almost surgical. Sleeping bags were laid out inside each tent, completely zipped up and arranged as if people were still in them. But when Kyle nudged one with his trekking pole, it was obviously empty. The fire pit in the center had logs arranged for burning, but they'd never been lit, and there were 5 camp chairs set up in a perfect circle around it. What really made my chest tighten was the cooler we found tucked behind one of the tents, still full of ice, with sandwiches wrapped in plastic that couldn't have been more than a day old, based on how fresh the bread looked. Christopher started taking photos with his phone while Megan kept asking who would leave all this expensive gear behind. Easily $2,000 worth of equipment just abandoned. Jason found the journal tucked into one of the tent pockets, a small waterproof notebook with entries dating back 3 days. The handwriting started neat and organized, detailing a group's plan to explore some caves they'd heard about from locals in Silverton. But the last entry from that morning was barely legible. Just the same phrase written over and over again, covering 2 full pages. They walk between the spaces. Kyle grabbed the journal from Jason and flipped through it himself, his face going pale when he reached the final pages where someone had drawn crude figures. Dozens of stick people with too many joints in their arms and legs, all surrounding what looked like a tent. We should have left then. Should have turned around and hiked back the way we came. But Jason convinced us we were only about 2 miles from where the trail reconnected with the main path according to his GPS, and none of us wanted to admit how scared we were getting. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountain peaks when we heard the first whistle, this long, clear note that seemed to come from somewhere above us on the ridge. We all stopped walking at the same time, looking up at the rocky cliffsides trying to spot another hiker, thinking maybe the people from the abandoned camp were somewhere nearby. Then came an answering whistle from the opposite side of the canyon, identical in pitch and length, followed by a third from somewhere behind us on the trail we'd just traveled. Kyle shouted out a greeting, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, asking if anyone needed help. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath, and then all 3 whistles repeated simultaneously, except this time, they were noticeably closer. Christopher pulled out his phone to record the sound, but the battery died instantly, even though he swore it had been at 60% just minutes before. We decided to set up camp right there instead of pushing forward in the growing darkness, choosing a spot with our backs against a solid rock wall so nothing could approach from behind. Our hands fumbled with the tent poles and stakes, everyone trying to work faster as the temperature dropped and those whistles continued every few minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always from multiple directions like we were being triangulated. Jason kept insisting it had to be other hikers playing some kind of prank. Maybe the people from the abandoned camp trying to scare others away from their gear so they could come back for it later. But when Megan pointed out that no one could move that quickly between those positions on such rough terrain, he didn't have an answer. We skipped dinner entirely, just crawled into our tents as soon as they were up, though none of us actually changed out of our hiking clothes or even took off our boots. I shared a tent with Kyle, and we lay there in our sleeping bags listening to the sounds outside gradually change as full darkness set in. The whistles had stopped about an hour after we made camp, replaced by something worse, footsteps circling our tents in a slow, measured pace. Not the random movement of an animal, but deliberate steps that would pause directly outside the tent wall, so close we could hear breathing that sounded wrong somehow, too deep and lasting too long, like whoever was out there had lungs twice the size of a normal person. Kyle gripped his knife so tight I could hear the leather handle creaking, and I had my hand on the bear spray, though we both knew that wouldn't help if a person really wanted to hurt us. Around midnight, Megan started crying in the tent next to ours, these quiet, muffled sobs while Jason whispered to her that everything would be okay, that we'd hike out first thing in the morning and report all of this to the rangers. Then Christopher's voice came from his solo tent, high and stretched thin with panic, saying someone was pressing against his tent wall, that he could see the outline of hands pushing in against the fabric. The next part happened so fast that even now, sitting here typing this out, I struggle to put the sequence of events in the right order. There was a sound like fabric tearing, but amplified, like someone had put a microphone next to ripping canvas, and Christopher just started screaming. Not words, but this raw, primal sound I'd never heard a human make before. Kyle and I burst out of our tent at the same time Jason emerged from his, all of us holding our phones with the flashlight function on, the beams swinging wildly through the darkness. Christopher's tent was still standing, but he was gone. Just gone, with a vertical slit down the side exactly like the ones we'd seen at the abandoned camp. His sleeping bag was still zipped up inside, his backpack untouched. But in the dirt outside the tear, we could see drag marks leading away into the darkness, along with those same boot prints he'd been wearing. Except between each footprint there were these other impressions, like someone had been walking on their knuckles alongside him, keeping pace. Jason wanted to follow the tracks immediately, but Megan became hysterical, grabbing his arm and screaming that we needed to leave now, that we needed to run back down the trail in the dark rather than wait for whatever took Christopher to come back. While they argued, Kyle and I stood there with our lights pointed at the darkness where the tracks disappeared, and that's when we saw them, eyes reflecting our lights from at least a dozen different positions among the rocks and trees, all at different heights, like some were crouching and others were standing on elevated positions. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched us as we slowly backed toward our tents to grab our packs. We didn't even stuff our sleeping bags, just shoved whatever we could into our backpacks in seconds and started running down the trail in the opposite direction from those eyes, Megan's sobbing echoing off the canyon walls as we stumbled through the darkness with only our phone lights to guide us. Though mine died completely, about 10 minutes into our desperate escape. What followed was 3 hours of pure terror that I can only remember in fragments, like my brain refused to properly record what was happening. We ran until our legs gave out, then walked, then ran again whenever we heard those whistles starting up behind us, always maintaining that same triangulated pattern but getting closer each time. At some point, Kyle just vanished. 1 second he was right beside me. The next there was nothing but empty trail, and his phone lying cracked on the ground, still showing the flashlight screen. I picked it up and kept moving because stopping meant joining him in whatever had happened. Jason and Megan were somewhere ahead of me, but their voices grew fainter until I couldn't hear them at all. Just my own ragged breathing and the sound of pursuit that never quite caught up, but never fell behind either. The trail split and merged and split again. Or maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion and dehydration. But I kept moving through brush that tore at my clothes and rocks that shredded my hands when I fell, which was often. Dawn found me stumbling along a service road I didn't recognize. My boots gone, though I don't remember taking them off or losing them, my feet bleeding and swollen from walking on rocks and gravel. A park maintenance crew found me sitting in the middle of the road, unable to tell them anything coherent except that we weren't alone out there, which I must have repeated dozens of times based on what the rescue coordinator told me later. They searched for 72 straight hours using helicopters, dogs, and volunteer teams, eventually finding our abandoned campsite and the tracks that led to a cliff edge where everything just stopped. All the boot prints, the drag marks, even those strange knuckle impressions just ended at a sheer drop with no bodies below. No equipment. Nothing. The official report lists them all as missing, presumed dead from a fall. But they never found any remains, and the investigators couldn't explain the abandoned camp we'd found, or why my friend's tracks seemed to show them walking calmly to the cliff edge, in a perfect single-file line based on the spacing, not running or struggling, but walking with measured, identical steps, like they were following something that left no tracks of its own. The Cascade Range has always been my escape from the chaos of Seattle. Every summer since college, those mountains called to me like an old friend, and this particular June in 2022 was no different. The guided trek advertised on the outdoor recreation board at REI seemed perfect. 3 days through lesser-known trails with a small group, led by someone who knew every rock and route along the path. 8 strangers total, including myself and the guide, all seeking something in those ancient peaks. Born in 1990, the same year Mount Redoubt erupted in Alaska, my mother always joked that mountains were in my blood from day one. What none of us knew was that we'd become one of those stories other hikers whisper about around campfires, the kind that makes people check their GPS twice and stay closer to established trails. My alarm went off at 4 in the morning that Tuesday, and by 5:30, I was pulling into the gravel parking area near Snoqualmie Pass, where we'd all agreed to meet before carpooling to the actual trailhead. The guide, a woman named Diane with silver streaks through her braided hair and laugh lines that suggested years of mountain sunshine, was already there, organizing gear in the back of her Subaru Outback. 2 other cars sat nearby, a dusty blue pickup with Idaho plates and a newer Toyota 4Runner that still had the dealership frame. The morning air carried that specific Pacific Northwest chill that promises heat later but demands layers now, and I remember zipping my fleece up to my chin while making awkward small talk with the others as they arrived. By 6:15, our complete group had assembled. Besides Diane and myself, there was a couple from Portland celebrating their 10th anniversary, 2 college buddies from Tacoma who kept making inside jokes about their fraternity days, a solo hiker named Walter who barely spoke above a whisper, and a woman around my age named Grace who worked as a nurse at Harborview Medical Center. We transferred our gear into 2 vehicles, Diane's Subaru and the 4Runner, which belonged to one of the Tacoma guys, and began the hour-long drive to the actual trailhead. The whole way there, Diane talked about the route, how we'd be following an old Forest Service trail that connected to a series of alpine lakes, most of which didn't even have official names, just numbers assigned by long-dead surveyors. The trailhead parking area was nothing more than a widened shoulder along a Forest Service road, marked only by a wooden post with the number 12 carved deep into the weathered grain. That marker would haunt me for months afterward, appearing in dreams where the numbers seemed to bleed sap like an open wound. Diane distributed the group gear among us: water purification tablets, first aid supplies, emergency beacons that she assured us we wouldn't need, but protocol demanded. The morning had warmed considerably by then, steam rising from the damp earth where sunshine broke through the canopy, and everything smelled like pine resin and moss. We signed the trail register attached to the post, each of us printing our names and emergency contacts in the rain-spotted notebook, never imagining those would be the last words some of us would ever write. The first few miles were exactly what you'd expect from a Cascade trail in early summer. Switchbacks through Douglas firs, occasional glimpses of snow-capped peaks through breaks in the trees, and the constant sound of water running somewhere just out of sight. Grace walked beside me for a while, talking about her shifts in the emergency room, how hiking helped her decompress from seeing humanity at its worst. The Portland couple, who introduced themselves as Tom and Heather, took photos at every scenic spot, their matching hiking boots and coordinated outdoor gear making them look like a REI catalog spread. But it was Walter who caught my attention most. He kept stopping every few hundred yards, not to catch his breath or admire the view, but to stare back down the trail we just climbed, his head tilted like he was listening for something specific. Around noon, we reached a small clearing where Diane suggested we break for lunch. The Tacoma guys, Aaron and Josh, had brought a portable speaker and started playing classic rock, which earned them a gentle but firm talking to from Diane about respecting the wilderness experience. While we ate our trail mix and sandwiches, Diane pulled out a laminated map and showed us our route. We'd camp tonight near the first alpine lake, tomorrow night at a higher elevation near a ridge she called the Sidewalk because of how flat and narrow it was, then loop back to the cars on day 3. She pointed to various landmarks, her finger tracing the dotted line of our path, but when she got to explaining the section after mile marker 12, her voice changed slightly, became more businesslike, almost rehearsed. "This part can be tricky," she said, tapping the map, "so we'll need to stay close together tomorrow morning." The afternoon hike grew progressively stranger, though nothing I could specifically point to as wrong. The forest seemed to swallow sound in odd ways. Aaron would be talking loudly just ahead of me, then his voice would cut out completely for a second before returning, like someone had briefly muted the world. Birds called from the canopy but never showed themselves, and twice I could have sworn I heard footsteps matching ours from somewhere off-trail. That peculiar rhythm of boots on earth that's unmistakable once you know it. When I mentioned it to Grace, she nodded slowly and admitted she'd been hearing it too. But when we told Diane, she just smiled and said the forest plays tricks. That sound bounces weird off the valley walls. Her explanation made perfect sense, but the way Walter immediately stepped closer to our group when she said it suggested he wasn't buying it either. We reached the first lake just before 5 that evening. A pristine circle of blue-green water surrounded by granite boulders and scraggly pines that had fought their way through cracks in the stone. The campsite was gorgeous, flat spots for tents, an established fire ring from previous hikers, and a view across the water to where the setting sun would paint the peaks orange and pink. While setting up camp, I noticed Josh filming everything with his phone, narrating in that influencer voice people use when they think they're creating content. "Day 1 of our epic Cascade adventure," he said to the camera, panning across our camp, and I remember thinking how stupid we all looked through that screen, like actors who didn't know our parts yet. Tom and Heather had brought a 2-person tent that they struggled with for 20 minutes before Aaron helped them figure out the rainfly, and Walter chose a spot far from everyone else, almost at the edge of where the forest started again, his small green tent looking like it wanted to disappear into the trees. Dinner was freeze-dried pad thai and instant mashed potatoes cooked on portable stoves, eaten while sitting on logs around the fire Diane had built with practiced efficiency. The conversation stayed light, everyone sharing their worst hiking experiences, funny animal encounters, the usual trail talk that bonds strangers who've chosen to walk into the wilderness together. But underneath it all was this weird tension, like we were all pretending not to notice something important. Grace kept checking her phone even though we had no signal, the screen's blue glow making her face look ghostly in the growing darkness. Around 9, just as the last light was fading from the sky, Walter suddenly stood up from where he'd been sitting silent at the edge of our circle and announced he was going back to his tent. "Need to write some things down," he said, patting a journal he pulled from his jacket pocket, and the way he looked at each of us, making deliberate eye contact like he was memorizing our faces, made my chest tighten with an anxiety I couldn't name. That night I woke up at what my watch said was 2:43 in the morning to the sound of someone walking through our camp. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, circling each tent in what seemed like a methodical pattern. Through the thin nylon of my tent wall, I could see a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth, too bright to be anyone's headlamp from our group. I held my breath, waiting for Diane's voice to ask if everything was okay, or for one of the guys to call out, but nobody said anything. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent for what must have been 30 seconds but felt like hours, and I could hear breathing, heavy and slightly ragged like someone who'd been running. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light clicked off and the footsteps moved away, not back toward any of our tents but straight into the forest, branches snapping and undergrowth rustling until the sounds faded into the ambient noise of wind through trees and water lapping at the lakeshore. The next morning at breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard the footsteps, trying to keep my voice casual while spooning instant oatmeal into my mouth. Grace immediately said yes, her relief visible that someone else had experienced it, and surprisingly, it was quiet Walter who spoke up next. "Counted the steps," he said, staring into his coffee cup like it held answers. 42 around each tent. Exact same number, exact same pattern. Diane listened to all of this with the expression I couldn't read, then explained that sometimes other hikers camped nearby, that the lake was popular despite being off the main trails. But when Tom asked why someone would circle our tents at 3 in the morning, she just shrugged and changed the subject to our route for the day. As we packed up camp, I noticed Josh reviewing videos on his phone from the night before, his face growing increasingly pale. When I asked what was wrong, he turned the screen toward me, in the background of a video he'd taken of the sunset, just at the edge of frame. There was a figure standing in the trees, completely still, watching our camp. The timestamp showed 7:23 in the evening, a full 2 hours before Walter had gone to his tent, 4 hours before the midnight visitor. We hit the trail by 8, everyone quieter than the day before, that forced cheerfulness from yesterday replaced by a watchful tension that made the forest feel hostile instead of peaceful. The trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up toward the ridge Diane had called the sidewalk, and with each turn, I found myself looking back, expecting to see someone following. About 2 miles in, we passed another wooden post, this one marked with the number 11, and Diane picked up her pace noticeably, urging us to keep together, keep moving. We wanted to make good time to the next camp. The forest changed as we climbed. The Douglas firs gave way to subalpine species, mountain hemlock and whitebark pine twisted by decades of harsh winters, and the undergrowth thinned out, leaving nowhere for anyone to hide. Yet that feeling of being watched only intensified, like the trees themselves had developed eyes. And when we finally reached mile marker 12 just before noon, Diane stopped so abruptly that Aaron almost ran into her back. The marker was different from the others. While 11 and the original trailhead marker had been simple posts with carved numbers, 12 was surrounded by a circle of stones, each one roughly the size of a human head, placed with deliberate precision. Inside the circle, the ground was bare dirt, compacted and smooth like it had been swept clean recently, and in the center sat a pile of hiking boots, at least a dozen pairs, arranged in a neat pyramid. Some looked decades old, leather cracked and laces rotted away, while others seemed almost new, including a pair of those expensive Salomon trail runners I'd seen at REI just last month. Heather made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, and Tom pulled her close, but it was Grace who voiced what we were all thinking. Those belonged to people. Where are the people? Diane stood frozen, her face drained of all color, and for the first time since we'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. This wasn't here last month, she whispered, and that's when we heard it. A whistle, long and low, coming from somewhere up the trail, followed by another from behind us, and then another from our left, like we were being triangulated. Walter dropped his pack and started running back down the trail before anyone could react, his journal falling from his pocket and landing in the dirt near the marker. Josh grabbed it, whether out of instinct or curiosity I don't know, and flipped it open to the last entry dated that morning. They're not following us, they're hurting us. Every sound, every sighting pushing us toward marker 12. I should have left last night when I had the chance, but I needed to warn the others. If you're reading this, don't go past the stones. The bones are under the stones. God help us all. The whistles were getting closer, and now we could hear branches breaking, deliberate and unhurried, like whatever was coming knew we had nowhere to run. Diane suddenly snapped back into guide mode, shouting for everyone to stay together, to head for the ridge where we'd have better visibility. But Tom and Heather were already backing away, and Aaron was pulling Josh toward a gap in the trees, everyone scattering in different directions despite her commands. I ran with Grace and Diane, the three of us crashing through the undergrowth, branches tearing at our clothes and packs, our breathing ragged and desperate. Behind us, the whistling had stopped, which was somehow worse than hearing it. And then came sounds I'll never forget. Screaming, but cut short, like someone had hit a mute button mid-cry. First from the direction Tom and Heather had gone, then from where Aaron and Josh had disappeared, and finally, most horribly, from back down the trail where Walter had fled. Grace was crying as we ran, and Diane kept repeating, almost there, like a mantra, leading us up a steep scramble of rocks toward the ridgeline. We burst out of the tree line onto the sidewalk, a narrow spine of granite with 1,000-foot drops on either side, and for a moment we just stood there, gasping, scanning the forest below for any sign of the others. That's when Josh's phone, which I didn't even realize I'd picked up when it fell from his pack, started recording on its own, the screen showing the video app active despite no one touching it. We stayed on that ridge for 6 hours, afraid to go back down, using Diane's emergency beacon to call for help that would take until nightfall to arrive. The search and rescue team found our campsite exactly as the reports would later describe. Tent still standing, food still in the pot over dead coals like we'd just stepped away for a moment, and 7 phones arranged in a perfect circle around the fire pit, all recording nothing but wind and static. They never found Tom, Heather, Aaron, Josh, or Walter, just their boots added to the pile at marker 12, which had somehow grown to include fresh pairs despite the area being sealed off within hours. Grace and I were evacuated by helicopter, both of us dehydrated and in shock, unable to explain what had happened in any way that made sense. Diane quit guiding after that, moved to Arizona last I heard, somewhere far from mountains and trees. The official report blamed our panic on a wildlife encounter, maybe a bear or mountain lion, and the disappearances on people getting lost after separating from the group. But they never explained the boots or the stones, or why every recording device captured the same static pattern that, when analyzed, contained what audio experts described as organized but non-human vocalizations. 3 weeks after the rescue, when the story had faded from the news and the trail had been officially closed pending investigation, a ranger found my car still parked at the original trailhead. The strange thing was, I'd driven home with Grace that day. We both remembered getting in her Honda and leaving my vehicle behind in our panic to get away. But there it was, keys in the ignition, my journal on the passenger seat open to a page I didn't remember writing. The handwriting was mine, but shaky, desperate, and all it said over and over was, "Don't go past mile marker 12," filling 3 entire pages. The last entry, dated the day after our rescue, was different. They let 3 leave so 3 could tell. The mountain needs its witnesses. Every generation, new boots for the pile, new stones for the circle. We were never lost. We were chosen. And some of us chose wrong. The police couldn't explain how my car got there, or how a journal entry could be dated after I was already home. And the therapist I've been seeing says, trauma can cause memory gaps, dissociative episodes where people do things they don't remember. I moved to Florida 6 months ago, as far from mountains as I could get. But sometimes I still wake up at 2:43 in the morning to the sound of whistling outside my window, even though I live on the 7th floor of a building surrounded by ocean. Grace calls me occasionally, always during daylight hours, and we dance around talking about what really happened, focusing instead on our new lives in flat places with no trees. Last week she mentioned finding a pair of hiking boots in her closet that she didn't remember buying. Still tagged from REI, exactly her size. I found a similar pair in my apartment yesterday, pristine Salomons that fit perfectly, and when I picked them up to throw them away, dirt fell from the treads. Dirt and small granite pebbles like the ones that surrounded marker 12. I haven't told anyone this, probably won't, but I've been having dreams where I'm back on that trail, except this time I'm the one whistling, the one walking through camps at night, counting 42 steps around each tent. In the dreams, I understand why it has to happen, why the mountain chooses who stays and who leaves, but I always wake up before I can remember the reason. All I know for certain is what I wrote in that journal, even if I can't remember writing it. If you find this, don't go past mile marker 12. "40 miles outside Asheville, tucked between ridges where cell service barely existed, stood this cabin my college roommate Victor found on some sketchy rental site for dirt cheap. January in the Appalachians meant snow packed 3 feet deep in some spots, ice coating every surface after dark, and temperatures that could kill you if you stayed outside too long without proper gear. At 28, teaching high school biology in Charlotte, I needed that isolation more than I cared to admit. Grading papers and dealing with parents had worn me down to nothing by winter break. Victor organized the whole weekend, convinced us all to drive up that Friday afternoon in 2 cars. Me, Victor, his girlfriend Allison, my buddy Cameron from work, plus Zoe and Bennett who we knew from our old trivia team downtown. Nobody questioned why the place cost so little, though we should have wondered why the owner rarely bothered maintaining it, why previous renters left such vague reviews online. Cameron stood out among us for all the wrong reasons. Rail-thin, perpetually anxious, the kind of guy who apologized for everything even when nothing needed apologizing for. While the rest of us unpacked groceries and argued about sleeping arrangements, he chain-smoked on the porch, tapping ash into an empty beer bottle he carried everywhere like some kind of security blanket. The cabin itself felt ancient, all dark wood paneling and furniture that belonged in somebody's grandmother's house circa 1975, complete with those creepy taxidermied deer heads watching us from every wall. Victor found this ancient motion sensor camera mounted by the back door, the kind hunters use to track game, covered in rust and barely functioning. We joked about it recording Bigfoot or catching bears going through the trash, never imagining we'd actually need to check what it captured. That first night passed normally enough. We drank too much bourbon, played cards until 3 in the morning, told the same college stories we always told when we got together. Saturday dragged by in a blur of hangovers and lazy conversation. Everyone nursing coffee and picking at leftover pizza while snow fell steadily outside the windows. Around 9 that evening, just as we started heating up dinner, Cameron announced he needed a cigarette and headed for the back door, wearing nothing but jeans and this ratty Nirvana t-shirt he'd owned since freshman year. Allison called after him to grab his coat. The thermometer by the window showed 12 degrees, but he waved her off, said he'd only be a minute, just needed a quick smoke before we ate. We kept cooking, Victor stirring pasta while Zoe set the table, Bennett hunting through cabinets for plates that weren't chipped or stained. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and Allison started getting annoyed because the food was ready and Cameron knew we were about to eat. Victor went to the back door, yanked it open, cold air rushing in like water breaking through a dam, and called Cameron's name into the darkness. No answer came back, just wind rattling through bare branches, and that peculiar silence you only get in mountains during winter, when snow muffles everything until the world feels wrapped in cotton. We figured Cameron had wandered around to the front porch, maybe got distracted looking at stars. The sky up there stretched endless and clear, no light pollution for miles. So Bennett checked out front while I grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the backyard. His footprints led straight from the door to a cluster of pine trees about 30 yards away, clear as anything in the fresh snow, but they didn't come back. The tracks just ended at the tree line, like he'd stood there for a while then simply vanished into thin air. Victor kept insisting Cameron must have walked along the trees, maybe circled around to smoke somewhere else. But we all saw the same thing. One set of prints going out, nothing coming back, and beyond those pines stretched miles of wilderness where the temperature would kill you before dawn if you got lost. Panic set in differently for each of us. Allison started crying immediately. Zoe pulled out her phone even though we all knew there was no signal. Bennett ran inside to check every room like Cameron might be hiding in a closet playing some sick joke. Victor and I grabbed better flashlights, 2 heavy mag lights we found under the kitchen sink, and followed those footprints to where they ended, examining the ground for any sign of which direction Cameron might have gone. The snow past the tree line lay pristine, untouched. Not even animal tracks marking its surface, just smooth white extending into darkness between the trunks. We screamed his name until our throats went raw, the sound echoing off the mountain before dying in that oppressive quiet. And all I could think about was Cameron out there in a t-shirt. No coat, no gloves. Probably dead already from hypothermia if he'd wandered too far. After an hour of searching, Victor remembered the motion sensor camera by the back door, that rusty thing we'd laughed about earlier, and suggested we check if it caught anything when Cameron went outside. The camera used these ancient SD cards, the kind from 15 years ago, and we had to dig through 3 laptops before finding one old enough to read it properly. We crowded around Zoe's ancient ThinkPad, 6 people breathing too loud in that cramped living room, waiting for the files to load while wind howled against the windows like something trying to get inside. The camera had triggered at 9:07 p.m. according to the timestamp, grainy black and white footage showing Cameron stepping out the back door, cigarette already between his lips, that empty beer bottle in his left hand for the ashes. He walked those 30 yards to the pine trees exactly like his footprints showed, stopped right at the edge where forest met yard, and just stood there facing the woods, not moving, not smoking, just standing perfectly still like someone had pressed pause on him. For 23 minutes, we watched every second. Cameron remained frozen in place while snow accumulated on his shoulders, never lighting that cigarette, never shifting his weight, never even turning his head when a deer passed within 10 feet of him around the 15-minute mark. Then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., He started walking forward into the woods with the same mechanical pace you'd use crossing a parking lot. No hesitation, no looking around, just walking straight ahead like someone had called his name from deep in those trees. The camera's range only covered about 50 feet past the tree line, but we watched him disappear into that darkness, barefoot. And this detail made everyone gasp, because somewhere between the door and the trees, he'd removed his boots and socks, left them placed neatly side by side in the snow, where we hadn't noticed them in our panic. Allison grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispered that people don't just walk into freezing woods barefoot, that something must have been wrong with Cameron before we even came up here. Maybe he'd been planning this all along. But I knew Cameron for 3 years, saw him every day at work, ate lunch with him in the teacher's lounge discussing lesson plans and complaining about standardized testing, and nothing about him suggested suicidal thoughts or mental illness beyond the general anxiety we all carried around like background noise. Victor rewound the footage, played it again frame by frame, and we noticed something else that made everyone stop breathing for a moment. About 5 minutes before Cameron moved, barely visible at the edge of the camera's range, another figure stood between the trees. Just a shadow really, could have been anything. A trick of the light or a tree trunk shaped weird. Except it wasn't there in the frames before or after those specific 5 minutes. And it seemed to shift slightly, swaying like someone doing that thing where you rock from foot to foot when you're waiting for something. Nobody wanted to say what we all thought, that someone had been out there watching Cameron, maybe calling to him somehow without making a sound we could hear, because acknowledging that meant accepting that our friend hadn't just wandered off in some fugue state, but had been lured into those woods by someone or something that knew exactly what they were doing. Bennett called 911 on the landline, the old rotary phone in the kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the cabin was built, and after explaining our situation 3 times to different dispatchers, they said search and rescue couldn't mobilize until morning due to the weather. Snow had picked up to near blizzard conditions, visibility down to nothing, too dangerous for helicopters or ground teams. We made our own search parties anyway, stupid and desperate, trudging through thigh-deep snow with flashlights that barely cut through the swirling white, screaming ourselves hoarse while knowing that Cameron had been out there over 2 hours now in nothing but jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot in sub-freezing temperatures. Victor and I pushed deepest into the woods, following what we thought might be footprints but turned out to be shadows and fallen branches, getting turned around twice before realizing we could die out there just as easily as Cameron, that the mountain didn't care about our friendship or guilt or need to find him. By midnight, we'd given up actively searching, huddled in the living room with every light in the cabin blazing, taking turns watching the back door like Cameron might walk through at any second with some ridiculous explanation about getting lost or finding another cabin where people invited him in for drinks. Around 3 in the morning, Zoe noticed something that made us check the footage one more time. Cameron's cigarette, the one he'd held but never smoked, wasn't in his hand when he walked into the woods. We scrubbed through the video until we found it. At the 19-minute mark, his right hand opened and the cigarette fell into the snow, followed immediately by the beer bottle from his left hand, both dropping like his fingers just stopped working. But here's what really disturbed us. His expression never changed. That blank stare never wavered, even as objects fell from his hands like his brain had disconnected from his body entirely. Victor pulled up articles on his phone about hypothermic paradox, that thing where freezing people strip their clothes off because they feel hot, but the temperature hadn't been cold enough for that severe of a reaction in such a short time, and it didn't explain the 23 minutes of absolute stillness, or the way he'd walked into those woods with such purposeful, measured steps. Search and rescue arrived at first light, a team of 8 people with dogs and thermal imaging equipment, real professionals who took one look at the footage and immediately called in state police. The lead officer, this weathered woman named Sergeant Fuller, who'd worked mountain rescues for 15 years, watched the video 3 times before asking if Cameron had any history of sleepwalking, seizure disorders, or drug use, particularly dissociatives like ketamine or PCP that could cause catatonic states. We told her about the shadow figure in the trees, pointed it out on the laptop screen, and she made notes but said nothing, just exchanged this look with her partner that suggested they'd seen something like this before. The dogs picked up Cameron's scent immediately, followed it about 200 yards into the woods before losing it at a small frozen creek, the handlers explaining that he must have walked through the water for some distance, though why anyone would wade through ice water barefoot in January defied all logic, unless they specifically wanted to throw off tracking dogs. They found Cameron's body 6 hours later, 4 miles from the cabin in a ravine nobody would accidentally stumble into, seated upright against a fallen log with his arms crossed over his chest, like he'd arranged himself for a formal portrait before dying. The medical examiner ruled it death by exposure, no signs of violence or drugs in his system, just a man who walked into the woods and sat down to die for reasons nobody could explain. But Sergeant Fuller pulled me aside before they left, asked if we'd noticed anything strange about the cabin itself, any weird feelings or odd dreams the night before Cameron disappeared. And when I said no, she handed me her card and said something I'll never forget. Sometimes these old mountain properties have histories we don't advertise to tourists, and sometimes people sensitive to those histories respond in ways that don't make sense to the rest of us. We left that afternoon, nobody wanting to spend another night in that place, and during the drive home I finally looked up the cabin's address and found 3 similar incidents over 40 years. People walking into those same woods in winter, always underdressed, always at night, always found later in that same ravine positioned peacefully like they'd chosen to be there. The year was 2015, middle of July, and at 12 years old, summer camp seemed like the perfect escape from my parents' divorce proceedings. Camp Whispering Pines sat deep in the Sawtooth Mountains, surrounded by nothing but wilderness for miles in every direction. The brochure promised 2 weeks of hiking, swimming, and campfires, but what happened that summer still keeps me awake at night, even now at 21. My cabin group had 8 kids, all around my age, supervised by 2 college-aged counselors who spent more time flirting with each other than watching us. The camp itself consisted of wooden cabins arranged in a semicircle around a main lodge, with trails branching off into the forest like veins. Everything felt normal those first 3 days, just kids being kids, until that Wednesday afternoon when I decided to explore beyond the marked trails during our free period. The counselors always told us to stay on the designated paths, but boredom makes you stupid when you're 12. About 20 minutes into my solo adventure, pushing through thick undergrowth that scratched at my legs, I stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden behind a cluster of pine trees, someone had built a crude shelter using tarps and branches, barely visible unless you were right on top of it. The blue tarp was weathered and torn in places, held down by rocks and rope tied to nearby trees. Inside, scattered across the dirt floor, were empty food wrappers from brands I recognized from our camp store, a filthy sleeping bag that reeked of sweat, and something else I couldn't identify. And what made my chest tighten with unease, a small purple backpack with cartoon unicorns on it, definitely belonging to a young child. My first instinct was to grab the backpack and run, but curiosity won over fear. Opening it with trembling fingers, I found a name written in marker on the inside flap, Lily Anderson, age 7, along with crayons, a coloring book, and a stuffed rabbit missing one eye. The pages in the coloring book were filled with disturbing drawings. Not typical kid stuff, but dark scribbles, and what looked like a tall figure standing over smaller shapes. Some pages had words written in shaky handwriting. He comes at night and wants to play games, repeated over and over. The sleeping bag had dark stains on it that I didn't want to think too hard about, and beneath it, partially buried in the dirt, I spotted what looked like strips of duct tape. That finally broke through my curiosity, sending me scrambling backwards out of the shelter, leaves crunching loudly under my feet as I ran back toward camp. Brian and Kevin, our counselors, were sitting on the lodge porch when I burst out of the tree line, gasping for air and trying to explain what I'd found. Brian, who couldn't have been older than 19, barely glanced up from his phone while Kevin laughed and ruffled my hair, telling me I'd probably just found some old campsite from hikers passing through. They said the mountains were full of people doing the trail systems, leaving stuff behind all the time, nothing to worry about. When I insisted about the child's backpack and the weird drawings, Brian finally looked at me and said, "Kids from town sometimes came up here to play in the woods, probably just forgot their stuff. Neither of them would come look at it with me, saying I shouldn't have been off the trail anyway and threatening to call my parents if I kept making up stories." The way they dismissed everything so quickly made anger burn in my chest. But what could a 12-year-old do against adults who wouldn't listen? That evening at dinner, I tried telling some of the other kids in my cabin about what I'd found, but most were too busy talking about the capture the flag game planned for the next day. Only Timothy, this quiet kid with thick glasses who read horror novels during rest time, seemed interested. He whispered that he'd heard strange noises the past 2 nights, like footsteps circling our cabin, but figured it was just counselors doing bed checks. We made plans to sneak out together the next day to look at the shelter, though neither of us really wanted to go back there. The cafeteria buzzed with normal camp chatter, complaints about the meatloaf, excitement about tomorrow's activities, gossip about which counselors were dating, while I pushed food around my plate, unable to stop thinking about those drawings and that missing girl's backpack. After dinner, during the nightly campfire, I kept scanning the dark tree line, expecting to see someone watching us, but there was only blackness beyond the fire's glow. The singing and s'mores ended around 9:30, and we all trudged back to our cabins for lights out at 10. Our cabin had 4 bunk beds, with me on a bottom bunk near the window, Timothy above me, and 6 other boys scattered throughout the room. Brian did a half-hearted head count, told us to keep it down, and left for the counselor's quarters, leaving us in darkness except for the moonlight filtering through thin curtains. Most of the guys fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hikes, but I lay awake listening to the forest sounds. Crickets, wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch. Around what must have been midnight, judging by the moon's position, those normal sounds stopped completely, leaving an unnatural silence that made my ears ring. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside our cabin wall. The footsteps moved along the exterior wall, pausing at each window, and I could hear breathing, deep, ragged breathing that didn't sound quite right, like someone with fluid in their lungs. When the shadow passed my window, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the sleeping bag over my head, but I could still hear it. Then came the whispering, barely audible at first, but growing clearer as whatever it was pressed closer to the walls. It was saying our names, one by one, in a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. Timothy, Matthew, Samuel. Each name drawn out, savored almost, and when it reached mine, the voice lingered, repeating it 3 times before moving on. Above me, I felt Timothy's bunk shake slightly. He was awake too, probably terrified like me. The whispering continued for maybe 10 minutes, circling our cabin twice, sometimes adding weird phrases between the names. Come play. The mountain is hungry. Lily wants friends. That last one made bile rise in my throat because I hadn't told anyone else about finding Lily's name in that backpack. By the time the footsteps finally retreated into the forest, my pillowcase was soaked with sweat and my jaw ached from clenching it so tight. I waited another hour before daring to whisper Timothy's name, and he immediately responded with a shaky, "Did you hear that too?" We stayed up the rest of the night talking in hushed voices, trying to make sense of what happened, both of us too scared to get up and find the counselors. When dawn finally broke around 5:30, painting the cabin in pale orange light, we noticed something that made our conversation die mid-sentence. Samuel's bed, 2 bunks over from mine, was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped and thrown aside like he'd left in a hurry. But Samuel was the heaviest sleeper in our cabin, the kid who once slept through a thunderstorm that shook the walls, and none of us had heard him get up during the night. Timothy and I exchanged panicked looks before I finally worked up the courage to check the cabin door, which should have been locked from the inside, but now stood slightly ajar, mud smeared across the handle. The chaos that erupted when we woke Brian was like nothing I'd ever seen at camp before. His face went from annoyed to pale in seconds when he saw Samuel's empty bed, and suddenly the lazy counselor transformed into someone barking orders and making frantic phone calls. Within an hour, the entire camp was in lockdown mode, with counselors counting and recounting kids, the camp director calling the local sheriff's department, and parent phone trees being activated. They questioned all of us repeatedly. When did we last see Samuel? Did he say anything about leaving? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? Timothy and I told them about the whispering and footsteps, and this time, Brian actually listened, his face growing more concerned with each detail. The sheriff arrived with a search and rescue team around 8 that morning, their dogs immediately picking up a scent trail leading from our cabin toward the forest. What really got everyone's attention, though, were the footprints in the mud outside, adult-sized boots heading toward the woods, and smaller barefoot prints that matched Samuel's size walking alongside them, not dragged or struggling, just walking like he'd chosen to go. The search team spent all morning combing through the woods while we were kept in the main lodge, parents being called to pick up their kids early. Around noon, one of the dogs led them straight to that hidden shelter I'd found, which was now empty except for fresh candy wrappers and something that made my whole body go cold: Samuel's inhaler, which he never went anywhere without, sitting right on top of that stained sleeping bag. The sheriff's team found more tracks leading deeper into the mountains, following old mining paths that hadn't been used in decades, but the trail went cold at a creek about 2 miles from camp. They brought in helicopters, more dogs, even volunteers from town, but as the afternoon wore on, the grim expressions on the adults' faces told us what nobody wanted to say out loud. My dad arrived around 4 to take me home, and as we drove away, I saw them bringing in more police cars and what looked like FBI agents, their black SUVs pulling up to the camp entrance. The story should have ended there, with a missing kid and a closed camp, but 3 days later something happened that still haunts me. Samuel walked out of the forest on his own, found by hikers about 15 miles from camp, dehydrated and confused but physically unharmed. The news called it a miracle. His parents cried on TV thanking everyone who searched, and the camp director gave statements about improved safety protocols. But Timothy and I stayed in touch, and he told me what Samuel said when he finally came back to school that fall, the story he only shared with a few kids before his parents moved them across the country. Samuel claimed he didn't remember leaving the cabin, just waking up in the woods with a tall man who had scars covering his neck and arms, living in different makeshift camps, moving every day. The man called himself Uncle Roy and said he was protecting special children from the mountain spirits, that he'd been collecting kids for years to keep them safe. Samuel remembered other children too, maybe 3 or 4, hiding in caves during the day, including a little girl who matched the age Lily would have been, though she never spoke, just drew pictures constantly with crayons. According to Samuel, on the 3rd night, Uncle Roy got spooked by something, packed up their camp in minutes, and told Samuel he wasn't ready yet before pointing him toward a trail and disappearing into the darkness. The police never found any Uncle Roy, no other children, no caves matching Samuel's descriptions, nothing but more abandoned campsites scattered throughout those mountains. The official report blamed it on trauma-induced false memories, maybe Stockholm Syndrome, and the case was quietly closed. Camp Whispering Pines never reopened. The property sold to developers who turned it into vacation homes, and most people forgot about that strange week in 2015. But I know what I heard that night, those whispers calling our names, and sometimes I wonder about all the missing hiker reports from that area over the years. I think about Lily Anderson, and whether she's still out there somewhere with Uncle Roy, drawing pictures in the dark, waiting for him to decide she's finally ready for whatever the mountain supposedly wants. I never went camping again after that summer, and even now, living in a city apartment far from any mountains, I still check my locks twice before bed and listen for footsteps that shouldn't be there. The dirt road to our campsite stretched for miles through Utah's backcountry, kicking up red dust that coated everything in the car. Hannah had her feet up on the dashboard, painting her toenails this bright purple color while I navigated the potholes and washouts. We'd been together long enough that these camping trips had become our ritual. Every few months we'd pack the Jeep and disappear into the wilderness for a weekend. She worked 12-hour shifts at the pediatric ward in Denver, and teaching biology to teenagers had me grading papers until midnight most nights, so by August we desperately needed this escape. The camping spot we'd found online was supposed to be this hidden plateau near Moab, far enough from the tourist trails that we'd have total privacy. After 4 hours of driving and another hour on unmarked roads, we finally reached the coordinates some random user had posted on a backcountry forum. Setting up camp on that clifftop felt like we'd discovered our own private paradise. The tent went up on this perfectly flat stretch of sandstone, maybe 50 feet from where the ground dropped away into a massive canyon system. Hannah started organizing our gear, while I gathered dead juniper branches for a fire, and we spent the afternoon exploring the rim trail and taking pictures of each other against the dramatic backdrop. Dinner was just freeze-dried pasta, but sitting there watching the rocks turn from orange to deep red to purple as the sun dropped made everything taste better. We were washing our dishes with the last of our water bottles when Hannah suddenly stopped mid-sentence and nodded toward the far side of the canyon. A figure stood at the opposite rim, probably 300 yards away but clearly visible against the lighter sky. Just standing there at the very edge, facing directly toward our camp, completely motionless like he'd been carved from the rock itself. We figured it was another camper enjoying the view. People did weird things in nature, and watching sunsets from dramatic vantage points wasn't unusual. But the guy never moved, not even to shift his weight or adjust his stance. Hannah waved at him, that friendly kind of wave you give other hikers on trails, but he didn't respond. After about 10 minutes of us periodically glancing over while we finished cleaning up, the darkness finally swallowed him up. We laughed about it, making jokes about meditation retreats and people taking those mindfulness apps too seriously. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared, so we crawled into our sleeping bags early, played cards by headlamp for a while, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the canyon below. Nothing else seemed unusual that first night, just the typical sounds of the desert, little animals rustling in the brush, an owl calling somewhere in the distance. Saturday morning came bright and clear, with that intense desert sun that makes you grateful for any patch of shade. We made instant coffee on the camp stove and planned out a longer hike down into the canyon itself, following what looked like an old deer trail we'd spotted the day before. The whole day was fantastic. We found this hidden spring surrounded by cottonwood trees at the canyon bottom, saw a family of bighorn sheep navigating the cliff faces, and Hannah discovered some pottery shards that must have been centuries old. We made it back to camp around 5 in the afternoon, dusty and exhausted but exhilarated. While Hannah rested in the tent, I started preparing dinner, cutting up vegetables on our little folding table. That's when I noticed him again. Same spot on the opposite rim, same eerily still posture, facing our camp exactly like the night before. The unease hit me harder this time. Nobody stands in the exact same spot 2 evenings in a row, especially not at the edge of a cliff where one wrong step means certain death. I called Hannah out of the tent and pointed him out, and we both stared across the canyon trying to make out any details. He wore dark clothing, maybe black or deep brown, and had something covering his head, possibly a hood or a hat with a wide brim. We couldn't see his face clearly, but the way his body angled toward us left no doubt about where his attention was focused. Hannah suggested yelling across to him, asking if he needed help or something, but the canyon swallowed up her voice before it got halfway across. The wind had picked up, creating this low humming sound as it moved through the rock formations, and somehow that made the whole scene feel more isolated and wrong. We decided to eat dinner inside the tent that night, zipping up all the windows and trying to pretend everything was normal. But every few minutes, one of us would peek through the mesh window to check if he was still there. He was, for nearly 2 hours, until darkness finally erased him from view. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both kept our headlamps within easy reach and spoke in hushed voices like we might be overheard. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee, and as I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible, my headlamp beam swept across the ground near our car. There in the fine red dust were footprints, boots with deep treads, forming a complete circle around the vehicle. They weren't there when we'd parked, and they definitely weren't ours. My heart started hammering as I followed the tracks with my light, seeing how they came from the direction of the canyon rim, circled our car multiple times, then led straight toward our tent before veering off back into the darkness. I woke Hannah immediately, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what I'd found. She grabbed her headlamp and we both went outside, following the footprints together. The tracks stopped about 3 feet from our tent's rainfly, and there were deeper impressions there like someone had stood in that spot for a long time, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Hannah found something else that made my mouth go dry. Cigarette butts, at least a dozen of them, crushed into the dirt right where the person had been standing. The brand was torn off each one, leaving just the white filters, and they were arranged in a small, deliberate pile. We'd been sleeping maybe 4 feet from where this stranger had been standing, smoking cigarettes and watching our tent in the darkness. The nearest ranger station was over 20 miles away on roads with no cell service, and our gas gauge had been hovering near empty since we'd arrived. We threw everything into the car in record time, not even bothering to properly pack the tent, just wadding it up and shoving it in the back. Hannah held a knife from our camp kitchen while I started the engine, and we both kept scanning the darkness beyond the headlights. The gas gauge needle sat just barely above the red line, and I knew the math didn't work. 20 miles of rough dirt road climbing up and down hills would drain what little fuel we had left, but staying felt impossible after seeing those footprints and cigarette butts. As I put the Jeep in reverse to turn around, the headlight swept across the canyon rim where the man had been standing. He was there again, visible in the beam for just a second, but this time he was moving, walking along the rim parallel to the direction we'd have to drive. Hannah saw him too, and grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, whispering that he knew exactly which road we'd have to take out. We sat there with the engine running, weighing our options. The math was simple and terrifying. We had maybe enough gas for 15 miles if we drove carefully, but the main highway was over 20 miles away. The dirt road had several steep climbs that would burn fuel even faster. Staying meant spending the night with someone who'd already proven they could reach our camp unseen, someone who'd stood inches from where we slept. Going meant potentially getting stranded on a dark mountain road with this person knowing exactly where we'd be stuck. Hannah remembered seeing an old Forest Service cabin on our way in, maybe 8 miles back, with what looked like a radio antenna on the roof. It was a gamble, but 8 miles we could definitely make, and maybe the cabin would have emergency supplies or a way to call for help. I turned the Jeep toward the road, driving slowly to conserve fuel, while Hannah kept watch behind us with her headlamp, looking for any sign of following headlights. The road seemed different in the darkness, every shadow potentially hiding someone, every curve blind to what might be waiting ahead. We drove in tense silence, the fuel gauge dropping steadily toward empty. About 4 miles in, Hannah suddenly yelled for me to stop. There was a vehicle parked just off the road ahead, barely visible through the juniper trees. It was an old pickup truck, rust-colored or maybe just covered in dirt, with no lights on and positioned so it partially blocked the narrow road. We couldn't see if anyone was inside it. I reversed about 50 yards and found a spot where I could turn around if needed, keeping the engine running while we debated what to do. That's when we heard it. Another engine starting up behind us, back the direction of our campsite. No headlights appeared, but the sound grew steadily closer. Someone driving in complete darkness on roads that were treacherous even in daylight. Hannah made the decision for both of us. She grabbed the wheel and yanked it hard to the right, sending us crashing through the sagebrush and around the parked truck. We scraped past with inches to spare, the passenger mirror snapping off against its tailgate, and I floored it up the next hill. The gas gauge dropped into the red, and the engine started that stuttering hesitation that meant we were running on fumes. Behind us, headlights suddenly blazed to life. both from the parked truck and the vehicle that had been following. They lit up the dust cloud we'd left behind, and I could see them in the mirrors, gaining on us fast. The Forest Service cabin appeared just as the engine died completely, our momentum carrying us into what used to be a parking area. It was more rundown than we'd realized passing it earlier. Windows boarded up, door hanging off its hinges. But Hannah was already out and running toward it before I'd even set the parking brake. The cabin was a mess inside. Furniture overturned and graffiti covering the walls, but the radio setup in the corner still had power from a solar panel on the roof. Hannah figured out how to work it while I barricaded the door with everything I could move. Through the cracked boards over the windows, I could see headlights pulling into the parking area, then darkness as they switched them off. The radio crackled to life just as we heard footsteps on the wooden porch outside, and Hannah practically screamed our location and situation to whoever was listening. A ranger's voice came back, saying they were 45 minutes out, but they were coming with backup. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, stopping at each window. Then nothing. Just silence for what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes. When we finally heard the approaching sirens and saw the emergency lights through the boards, we found the parking area empty except for our Jeep. The rangers said they'd passed no vehicles on the road coming up. Whoever it was had vanished into the wilderness, leaving only tire tracks and the memory of that terrible night. We never went camping in remote areas again. The air at Paradise Base that morning carried a strange stillness, the kind that made every sound sharper. I had been guiding climbs for almost a decade, and Mount Rainier was supposed to be routine compared to the Himalayas. My name's Daniel, and that week I was part of a 4-person team prepping for a technical ascent before the next storm front closed in. The mountain looked deceptively calm from below, sunlight hitting its ridges like polished glass, but everyone knew how fast it could turn. We were scheduled for a 5-day push, 2 nights at high camp, nothing extraordinary. Or at least that was the plan. Our team consisted of seasoned climbers. Emily, a paramedic from Montana with a quiet focus that made you trust her instantly. Marcus, the oldest of us, whose humor kept the air light even when conditions didn't. And Eric, a new addition who'd just returned from Denali. I had met Eric through a mutual friend, and though he was competent, there was something in his silence that I couldn't quite read. We spent the first day hiking through dense fog, the ice crunching under our crampons, our breath clouding like steam as we adjusted to the altitude. The climb itself felt routine, until we reached an area I didn't recognize on the map. The ridge flattened into a narrow plateau, a place scoured by wind and time. That was where we saw them. The remains of tents half buried in snow, guy lines torn and tangled, cooking gear scattered like someone had fled in a hurry. Marcus crouched down, brushing away the frost from a sleeping bag that had frozen stiff. "This wasn't here last season," he muttered. I noticed a torn patch of fabric marked with a logo from an old expedition company that had folded 2 years earlier. The same one connected to the missing team whose bodies were never recovered. We all went silent for a moment. The radio static broke the quiet, faint but distinct, as if whispering through the wind. That night, the mountain didn't rest. The wind roared against the fabric of our tents, and every now and then the static on the radio would spike into bursts. But it wasn't random. We could make out words. Our words. Conversations we had earlier that day, replaying with eerie precision, like the mountain itself had been listening. Emily tried to rationalize it, said the cold might have been interfering with the frequency, but I could tell she didn't believe it. None of us did. The air inside the tent felt charged, the kind of tension that makes you hesitate to even breathe too loudly. By the second night, the weather had started closing in. Clouds rolled down from the upper ridges like slow smoke, swallowing everything in white. We built snow walls around the tents and anchored them deeper, though the wind still managed to slip through in thin howls. I barely slept. The radio kept crackling, faint echoes of our voices rising and fading like they were being pulled apart. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus swore he heard footsteps circling outside. He unzipped the tent, flashlight cutting through the snow, but there was no one there. Only the static, now louder, like heavy breathing between bursts of noise. Morning brought a grim silence. The storm had buried most of our tracks, but one was unmistakable. A single trail of fresh boot prints leading away from camp, heading higher into the slope. Eric was gone. His tent flap was open, his pack still inside, along with his gloves and rope harness. We called his name until our throats burned, but the mountains swallowed the sound whole. Emily wanted to go after him immediately, but climbing higher in that storm was suicide. We radioed base for help, but all we got back was a wall of interference, fragments of words we couldn't make out. As the hours dragged on, small things began to shift around camp. A carabiner that had been on the cooking line ended up half buried 10 meters away. My ice axe, which I'd left propped against a snow wall, was lying beside my tent with its handle cracked. Emily said she thought she saw someone moving near the edge of the ridge, a dark outline against the wind. But when we went to check, there was only open snow. That was when Marcus started saying we were being followed, that maybe Eric hadn't wandered off at all. His voice had that trembling edge that makes you realize fear is starting to win. That night, the static returned, not as background noise, but as a voice. It called each of our names, repeating them in order, with a delay that didn't match any radio pattern I'd ever heard. Sometimes it mimicked what we said seconds after we said it. Other times it whispered words none of us had spoken. Emily tried switching channels, but every frequency bled into the same hollow echo. The mountains sounded alive, and whatever it was, wind, interference, or something else entirely, it wanted us to hear it. By dawn, Marcus was gone too. His tent had collapsed under the snow, and only one line of prints led away, the same direction as Eric's. It did not make sense. No one would climb higher without gear or oxygen. Emily and I packed up what we could, planning to descend before the storm worsened. Every step felt like walking through static. The air hummed around us, and sometimes through the wind, I swore I heard Marcus shouting my name. It sounded close, but when I turned, the slope stretched empty in every direction. I stopped answering after a while. Midway down the glacier, our radio came alive again. The voice on the other end sounded like me. Same tone, same pauses, saying words I had not spoken yet. It repeated my last sentence seconds before I could finish it, overlapping itself like an echo that shouldn't exist. Emily dropped the radio in panic. When I picked it up, the voice changed. It was Eric now, calm and deliberate, saying, "You left me up here." The transmission cut into white noise so sharp it hurt to listen. We made it back to base late that night, frostbitten and half delirious. The rescue team that went up 2 days later found no trace of Marcus or Eric. Their prints stopped near a crevasse, but the snow had swallowed everything else. The old camp we found was gone too. Tents, gear, all of it buried under a fresh drift as if it had never existed. The only thing left behind was our broken radio, sitting on the surface where we had left it. Power light still flickering even though the batteries were dead. It has been years since that climb. I still guide expeditions, but I have never returned to Mount Rainier. Sometimes, late at night, I leave my radio on just for the background noise. Every once in a while, through the hiss of static, I hear it, my own voice calling out names I have tried hard to forget. The mountains had always been my refuge, a place where silence felt like an old friend, rather than something to fear. I had been a ranger for almost a decade, used to long stretches of solitude and unpredictable weather, but that night was different. I had been assigned to drive through a remote pass to check a maintenance station that had gone quiet. My shift was supposed to end before midnight, yet the road wound endlessly upward through dark pines that swallowed the light from my headlights. The only sound was the steady hum of the truck's engine and the occasional snap of gravel under the tires. About halfway through the pass, the fog appeared, not rolling in from the valleys like it normally would, It rose, thick and milky, from the ground itself. It was so sudden that I thought I was driving through smoke from a nearby fire. I slowed down, trying to find the yellow lines, but they vanished under the gray blanket. The air outside the window had that cold, heavy stillness that made the world feel suspended. I kept the engine running and leaned forward, squinting at what looked like a faint glow just ahead, but the light moved, sideways, then backward, like it was circling me. I grabbed the radio, trying to call the dispatch office. Static hissed for a few seconds before something else cut through. It was a voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. It said my name. Not once, but several times, each with a different tone. One sounded like it came from a child. Another was deeper, like someone whispering directly into the mic. I thought maybe I'd stumbled into interference from another channel, but when I turned the volume down, the voice grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was in the air, thin, echoing like it was being carried by the fog itself. The fear didn't hit me all at once. It crept in quietly, the kind that makes you question if your mind is playing tricks. I turned off the engine to listen, and for a few seconds, there was nothing, just the soft hiss of wind against metal. Then, a tap on the side of the truck, just one, then another. I spun the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam only showed my own breath hanging in the cold. The fog seemed thicker near the trees, pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. I remember gripping the wheel, waiting for something, anything to move, but everything stayed impossibly still. The whispers returned, but this time they came from the passenger side, soft at first, then overlapping like several voices speaking over one another. My own name again, drawn out, almost affectionate. I told myself it had to be the wind. There was no other rational explanation. Still, I could not ignore the way the fog pressed against the glass as if it had weight, forming faint shapes that shifted whenever I blinked. One moment I thought I saw a handprint on the window. The next, it was gone. The fog wasn't moving with the wind. It was moving against it. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I started the truck again and tried reversing, but the tires only spun on the gravel. The headlights were swallowed by the white wall around me. That was when I noticed the clock on the dashboard. It had stopped. The seconds weren't ticking. I tapped the glass, then my wristwatch, but both were frozen at the same time. 12:03. I blinked, checked again. Still 12:03. The air inside the truck had turned icy, every breath forming a small cloud. My radio crackled to life once more, and this time it wasn't just voices. It was breathing, deep, close, and uneven, like someone sitting right behind me. I turned, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. The beam cut through the fog-filled cabin, revealing nothing but my own jacket slung over the back seat. I remember whispering, "Who's there?" without even realizing I'd said it aloud. No answer came, but something brushed the edge of the truck bed, a soft scrape, followed by a low knock. 3 times. Each sound landed like it was measured, deliberate. I pressed the horn, half hoping to startle whatever was out there, but it didn't echo back. It was swallowed by the fog as if the air itself had absorbed it. The next thing I remember clearly is the silence that followed. I must have sat there for hours, though it felt like minutes. My eyes kept darting between the windshield and the rearview mirror, even though I could barely see past my own reflection. I thought about stepping out, walking until I found a signal, but something about the fog made that feel like stepping into a dream I wouldn't wake from. The edges of my vision began to blur. I don't know if I passed out or if something else happened, but the next time I opened my eyes, the truck was bathed in pale light. Dawn had come, but not the way it should have. The fog thinned in slow spirals, peeling away like smoke. My hands were stiff on the steering wheel, my neck sore as if I had been sleeping upright for hours. When I stepped out, the air hit me with a strange stillness, heavy with dew. The road behind me was gone. Where the asphalt should have been, there was a cliff, a sheer drop stretching down into mist. My tire marks ended right at the edge. I stood there staring, unable to figure out how I could have driven that far without noticing. The GPS on the dashboard was still blinking, the screen faintly flickering. The coordinates didn't make sense. They placed me in a blank section of terrain, miles from the nearest mapped road. According to the tracker, the truck had been parked there for 7 hours straight. 7 hours that I couldn't account for. My last memory before dawn had been of the fog pressing against the glass. And then nothing. I checked the clock again. It was working now. 7:13. The radio hissed softly with low static, and just beneath it, a voice whispered my name once more, clear as breath against my ear. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, no one believed the story. They said fog banks in the mountains could cause disorientation, that maybe I had fallen asleep from exhaustion, but I knew I hadn't dreamed it. I showed them the GPS data, but when they checked it later, the file was gone, completely wiped. The coordinates I had written down on paper led to nothing but dense forest. The pass itself wasn't even listed on the updated maps anymore, as if it had never existed. I still patrol that region sometimes, though I avoid that route. On certain mornings when the weather turns gray, I hear faint static through my handheld radio, a sound too familiar to ignore. Once I thought I heard my name again, carried by a gust of wind that came from nowhere. I stopped answering after that. Whatever happened in that fog, whatever called to me through it, I am certain of one thing. If I had stepped out of that truck that night, I would not have found my way back.